Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another conversation with Christoffer Døhlen, and we want to talk about language because language is very important, and there seems to be a certain trend among progressive or left-leaning people sometimes to redefine words that have been understood in a certain way and to somehow redefine their meaning or to use them to mean different things. And we both think that this is very problematic actually. And so we want to start by looking a little bit at language in general from a philosophical view, what it is, what its function is, and then go on to discuss why it's a problem to redefine terms that in a way that people are not used to using them. So maybe, yes, what are your initial thoughts, Christoffer, on language and on kind of the philosophical context of what language is and how we use it and all that?
Thank you, Amos. Yeah, so this question about language seems to be a very relevant and huge topic to talk about, because language is something that all of us human beings, except those who are, of course, in coma or extremely mentally handicapped, but ordinarily human beings use language. And it seems that the basic function or purpose of language is to communicate truths to other human beings. You can say that you have as a person, you have certain ideas or certain pieces of knowledge about reality that you want to transmit or send to other human beings. And of course, there are technically multiple ways one can do that. One can make some signals with the arms. One can try to do stuff like animals do with making certain sounds, like having your foot in the back to make some sound, or moving your arms. But it seems that human beings have this capacity to communicate these truths by the use of words. And these words are combined together in what we call sentences, and sentences can be structured in paragraphs or texts. And this is basically language. It's using words and having these words combined in certain ways to formulate basically certain things, how they are related to each other, or the content of certain things that you have an idea of. So I suppose we could say that language is about communicating truth or information, and it manifests through words that represent certain ideas or concepts. And when these words are put together in sentences or longer texts, and sentences combined into longer texts, then we have many words, many concepts, many ideas that communicate a certain relationship between them. So that's sort of, I suppose, my initial thoughts about what language is, what it is meant for, why we use it.
Yes, so I think these are very good thoughts that you mentioned here. And so I would agree that the purpose of language is to transmit information, and specifically to transmit truth. So to transmit true information about reality from one human being to another. And so one interesting question here is also, how do specific words get their meaning? Because we use words kind of as a shorthand or as a representation for certain entities or certain characteristics or relationships between entities. So for example, if I say the word tree, then everybody who speaks English knows what this word represents. And so it kind of awakes this image of a tree in your mind when you hear me speak, and therefore this these noises that I make with my mouth are intelligible to you, so you can understand the meaning that I'm trying to transmit. And the way I see it is that these basically these things develop in the beginning more or less by chance, but then as soon as you have a basis of certain words, then this basis can adapt over time. So maybe the pronunciation sometimes changes over time, or the meaning of a certain word can also change over time, but it's a social process. So it happens kind of within the entire group of people who use this language. This is kind of a process that develops over time. So it's not one or a few people who control this process, but it's kind of just developing on its own through the way that people are speaking to each other, and sometimes they maybe use a different intonation to transmit a slightly different meaning, and so it can shift over time. But it's from moment to moment, language is actually quite stable, because else we couldn't understand each other. And so I think also that small children learn the meaning of words simply by people pointing at stuff and saying the name of this object. So for example, they have a small book where there are pictures of a cow, and then the mother says, look, this is a cow, or this is a dog. And so in that sense, every human being learns to make a connection between a certain entity or a certain characteristic and a certain word. And in that sense, then we can use these words to communicate with each other. What do you think of this theory?
Right, so it seems that we made some very good points there about the, you can say, origin of language, or the means by which we create and develop language. And I think that I would sort of see it as being some sort of a tradition that is handed down to us from our ancestors. And sometimes the language might change a little bit, that some words become too antique, would perhaps some people say, and therefore we change the slight words or sentences or expressions here and there. But by and large, it seems that the language is kept or preserved in a social way by a specific kind of society, and that it's basically handed down from their parents and their grandparents and etc., and being handed down. So it seems very much to be a tradition, it would seem to me. And I want to say that this sort of language is a certain kind of common good to that specific society. In the same way that you have cultural norms and customs in general, language can be such a thing that makes the society have something in common that unites them. This of course we see when it comes to distinguishing nations or communities. For instance, you live in Switzerland, so you have, well, of course, Switzerland have several languages, German and French, etc. But generally, it seems that nations have their own national language. We have France speaking French, we have Norway, Norwegians like me speaking Norwegian, and Swedish people speaking Swedish, etc., etc. So it seems to be a sort of common good, a tradition that is handed down to us. And I also would say that you pointed out this phenomena of children growing up and taking to them or absorbing words into their way of thinking or talking about the world, basically communicating things, and they're taking that from their parents, their friends perhaps, or neighbors or whatever. And it seems that it reflects a very unique capacity in us human beings, that we are able to absorb words that we hear from other people, and thereby manage to structure these words in specific sentences and combine them in ways that create sophisticated ideas and information that you can sort of present to other people. Noam Chomsky, the very famous theorist within linguistics, he talked about this very unique capacity of human beings to structure words within their own mind, to make very sophisticated and complicated sentences in their own way, instead of simply taking it from other people. So perhaps you could say that the matter, the material, basic means are the words they take from other people, but then the form of the sentences are something that they combine within their own mind. So that reflects a very unique capacity of human beings. And also, I would also point out that it's very important to understand that language is, many people seems to think that language is very arbitrary. It's just a social convention. It's just something that we have subjectively. Now, it's true that language manifests in, you could say, social conventions. For instance, it's basically, we in Norway speak Norwegian because that's the language that we have developed socially. But still, we have to remember that language reflects and represents objective reality. The words that we communicate to each other refer to something that is objectively existing out there. So it's true that perhaps the specific letters that are put together in this specific word, you could say that, yes, that's particular to this specific society. But language always represents something objective. And in fact, if you were to deny that, if you were to say that language has no objective meaning whatsoever, then you could actually say that you are in some sort of contradiction, because you're using language to refer to something which you deny. So it's sort of a self-defeating thing there. So that's also important to keep in mind, that yes, language can be different from society to society. You have Norwegian, Swedish, French, English, etc., Chinese, Indian, but they always represent something that is objectively existing out there.
Yes, I think that's an important point that some people like to ignore, that language represents something in reality. I think also an important point that you touched upon is that language is actually a part of tradition, because nobody invents the language that he uses, but it comes from a long line of tradition over many generations. Probably it's even more long-lived than many other traditions that we have, because some traditions, they come and go, but the language is very, very constant in a culture. And I think also one important aspect in this sense is that different cultures have different languages, and these different languages sometimes allow people to express different aspects of their environment with different importance. So, for example, in the Inuit tribes that live in the places where there is always snow, they have, like, I don't know, 20 different words for white. They have 20 different kinds of white, because it's very important for them to describe the different aspects of white in order to, for example, describe a way from here to some other place, or to describe something that they saw, whereas many other languages only have one word for white, which is just white. Or maybe we have white and beige and light yellow or something like that, but this is not such a big aspect of our reality, for example, in English-speaking places or also in Switzerland, and so we don't have as many words for this aspect of reality. And so language is also culture specific in that sense, that it shows things that are very important to a culture, because there the language is more differentiated, and then it shows things which are not so important to a culture, and there the language is less differentiated. And so this brings me to a very important point, which is actually you cannot think really in an articulate manner about something if you don't have language to describe it, because you think in concepts and you think in words, or the words represent the concepts, and so your conscious thought process has to manipulate these concepts, and therefore language is directly linked also to thinking. And I think here we start to come to the big danger of people or a small group in society trying to control language or the use of language, because this directly goes into the mind and the thought process of each individual within that culture. Because if you start to redefine terms or to make terms, mark them as evil, so there is now a lot of words that you are no longer allowed to use, or you insert certain types of pronouns or words that everybody has to use, then you actually start to mess with people's ability to think, because we use words to refer to these concepts, and we cannot think without using these words and these concepts.
Right, yes, I think you brought up some very good points there. And it seems to me also that one of the problems, as you pointed out, with the abuse or exploitation of words by specific ideologies, seem to be that have terms or refers to very specific concrete things and have a very specific meaning and specific connotations. So people associate words with specific things and ideas. And you, for instance, have many kind of terms which have traditionally had a very positive content, something that people refer to as very good. For instance, terms like freedom or justice, or more specifically, social justice or love. These words or terms are obviously something that is good. They refer to good things: freedom, justice, love, etc. And I think one of the problems with the progressive ideological movement is that they exploit these words, having these very good associations, and they empty them out of the traditional meaning in those words and replacing them with their own ideological understanding of these things. So social justice is a very good example. Today, many radical leftists are basically promoting what they call social justice, and that is linked to this idea that we need to tear down the system as we have now. We have to tear down tradition and custom and the family and social roles for men and women and everything. We need to establish this socialist woke paradise, basically. And of course, you have this term that has been used sometimes, the idea of a social justice warrior, which is supposed to refer to very radical leftists promoting this very progressive leftist agenda of how the world should work. And social justice have been associated with that. But if you go back in history, take for instance the 19th century, you had several Christian theorists who talked about social justice, defended it, but of course that had nothing to do with this very woke progressive agenda that we see today. Rather, that has to do with a very Christian conservative type of society. So here is a very good example of how we see a very traditional term, social justice, being exploited and used by the modern progressivists. And of course, social justice is something good. All of us want justice, and as a just society is something that is desired by philosophers since Plato and before that, probably. But we see that they sort of exploit this goodness that the term is referring to, and sort of distort it into their own ideology, so that social justice has to be associated with their own wokeness. And this social justice refers to something good. It tries to combine wokeness and goodness in a sense that people sort of are drawn toward it. So that's just one example of how this is a very, you could say, frustrating problem, to put it that way.
Yes, yes, I think that's a good example, and you showed one of the problems very nicely, which is this exploitation of words, because as we said, language is a very conservative, so it develops slowly over a long period of time, and therefore certain words have a good connotation. Just the word sounds like something good, like justice or virtue or liberty or freedom or love or these things. And also other words have a bad connotation with them, like racist, for example, or like evil or hateful or these kinds of things, or violence. And what some people on the left, or at least to a larger degree than on the right, I think what they do is they don't really have an argument. They just use this emotional weight of these words, but then they switch the meaning inside. So it's like a Trojan horse kind of thing. So for example, yes, they start calling all kinds of things violence, like hate speech is violence, or silence is violence, or all kind of this stuff. But no, actually violence used to mean to physically hurt the body or property of another being. So it had a really specific meaning, and now it's kind of everything that the left doesn't like is violence somehow. And everybody that disagrees with them is hateful. And no, hate also used to have a specific meaning. It's connected with an emotion when you really want something bad to happen to this person or thing that you hate. So yes, and that really, it's really a problem, because it basically, it makes it almost impossible to really have a dialogue about the ideas or about certain actions or certain ways of organizing society, because the language is the basis for having any kind of dialogue about anything. And if you start to, there's this funny fairy tale where a man decides to call his chair a table, and his table he calls a kitchen, and his kitchen he calls the house, and he defines every word in another manner, and in the end he just cannot speak with anyone anymore. And so that's kind of what's happening here. And this is a very bad thing, because if you have groups of people living very close to each other and they can no longer communicate through words, then they will soon start to fight with each other. And so that's really the danger that's at stake here, I think.
Right. Yeah, I was just reminded on a very old Norwegian video parody of some funny video where you had this guy who ran the shop, and then some customer came in and wanted something, a chicken or something, and then he gave him something completely different because he switched the wording. so sort of now chicken meant some completely different thing, like potatoes. And he said, no, that's not chicken, that's potatoes. Oh, you said potatoes? Well, let me go and bring the potatoes. And then he brought something completely different that wasn't potatoes at all. So I just reminded of that funny parody, an old funny Norwegian video. And yes, it seems that is to, of course, not in the sense that this parody video does it, but it seems that this is done with several important words with that the progressive left today abuses, like, as you mentioned and I mentioned, liberty, justice, love, etc. And it seems very clear that they are simply using these old words with a very specific and logical and coherent meaning, and then they're basically making them empty of that meaning, emptying them out, and then replacing them with this a new meaning that is often not logical and very emotional and chaotic. For instance, you have this slogan, "Love is love," usually used in this idea of pride or homosexual marriage or things like that. And of course, you might ask them, well, what do you mean by love? What is love? If you go back to the traditional philosophers, many of them would have defined love as willing the good of another human being, wanting him to have human goods that enhance his own nature or bring him to the supernatural end of heaven, if you ask the Christian philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas. But now it seems that love is being this very vague and loose understanding that somehow will justify sexual attractions without any discussion of whether that is good or bad. So it seems to be very chaotic, basically. And yes, I mentioned this idea of homosexual marriage also seems to be this abuse of a traditional term, marriage, which has a very specific essence, and that is to bind a man and a woman together, to have children and to create a family. That was the basic understanding of marriage for a very, very, very long time. And now it seems that they have not only abused the term, but also the institution itself to simply mean two people being romantically attracted to each other, completely divorced from the essence that was understood and very related to marriage before. And yes, it seems to be a very prevalent thing, both with good terms being exploited and bad terms being exploited and used toward their opponents, such as you mentioned hate or hate speech. Hate was basically willing evil for other people, wanting to do them harm. So the opposite of what love was. But today it seems that if you criticize some behavior that is related to individuals wanting to express their own sexuality, and you think that is morally wrong, they equate that to wanting them to be harmed or wanting evil to happen to them. But of course, that of course presupposes the idea that it is intrinsically evil to object to self-expression no matter what. So it seems to be this very vague, very loose, very incoherent ideas that are connected to this word as the progressivists abuse them, and they don't really have any philosophical, metaphysical ideas to put it in a very logical meaning. So that seems to be sort of the two problems here, that they abuse words, empty them out of traditional meaning and replacing them with something new, and this new meaning is often very incoherent, to put it that way. Yeah.
I think just one thought that entered my mind now is actually that it's not really incoherent, but it's just they change the meaning of the words so that they imply basically that their own philosophy is true. So they have certain metaphysical and other axioms, and also axioms of what, for example, a good life for a human being is, and they redefine basically all the words of the language to imply these other axioms. So as you said, for example, love is now no longer wanting the good for someone, meaning either something that leads him to a good life materially or maybe even spiritually, but it's basically just the emotion that you feel when you are, yes, romantically or sexually attracted to someone. And or there was another example that you just made before, which has slipped my mind, but I think what actually happens is that they redefine the words in a way that they automatically imply the liberal progressive ideology, so that you cannot then really argue against it anymore, or the words themselves kind of seem to make it self-evident that it is true. And they do this basically, as we already said, by taking emotionally very positive words and just putting their own ideology into them, and then taking very negative words and putting the opposite, like other opinions or other ideologies, into there. And so I think if you really look at this process and you kind of keep continuing it, then at some point it seems like it reminds me of the story of the Tower of Babel, where the people all spoke the same language, but all of a sudden they couldn't understand each other anymore. And that's kind of what could be at the end of this process, that you have basically you have liberals and you have conservatives living in the same general region, let's call it the West, or also maybe in the same country. And they even speak the same language, but it's not the same language anymore because they use these words so completely differently that they just think what the other person utters makes absolutely no sense. It's completely incoherent because they have defined every important word in a different manner. And then you have like two, and then basically these two cultures can no longer coexist. There is just the possibility of separating peacefully or separating violently. And I really think this is a very real danger at the moment, that this kind of growing more and more apart and being less able to speak with one another, it doesn't lead to a peaceful coexistence, because you need to be able to talk with one another and to understand what the other person is trying to tell you in order to coexist peacefully.
Right, that's a good point there. And I was also thinking that when you have certain ideological groups or individuals who have their own ideological understanding of specific words, then of course when you have discussions or disagreements, they can come up with very many loaded questions, which can be very frustrating to receive. For instance, if you have this, let's say you have a transgender debate and you have a person who opposes transgenderism, and then the supporter of this transgenderist ideology is asking this person, well, don't you want people to be free, or don't you want people to have the right to be themselves? And of course, when you put it that way, it sounds like something good to, of course, who wouldn't want freedom, or who wouldn't want people to simply be themselves? But what does that mean? What does it mean to be free? What is freedom? What does it mean to be yourself? Here, of course, you have these philosophical premises of what identity is, and what does it mean to have a right? What does it mean to be yourself? And all of these things are basically leading to this very loaded question. So that, of course, hinders lots of productive dialogue, because you have these different understandings of terms, and you have very many loaded questions and loaded statements. And for instance, if you have, I can give another example of a person who criticized Antifa for doing violence in the streets and doing bad things to society. And then the other person who supports Antifa could perhaps answer, well, so you don't think we should condemn fascism? But of course, that doesn't mean that you have to support Antifa, but of course, they equate fascism with people who oppose Antifa and the people whom Antifa targets. And that, of course, is very problematic. And it seems to be many leftists, also leftists that I have encountered myself, who use this term fascism in a very broad sense, and they seem to simply look at a specific person or a specific expression and identify that with a specific trait. That, oh, that sounds like it's sort of violent, or that sounds a little bit authoritarian in a certain way, therefore it has to be fascist. And of course, the traditional understanding of fascism was this very specific political philosophy espoused by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile in Italy. And it had a very specific meaning. It was about this idea of the state being the manifestation of a people, this idea of the total state being the supreme of the society, and everything has to be related to that state. It had to do with totalitarianism, mobilizing all of society to serve the supreme states, with a very specific political philosophy. And the leftists seem to have simply emptied fascism out of its meaning and simply target that label toward people whom they think are violent or right-wing extreme. I mean, even one such leftist called Ben Shapiro a pseudo-fascist. I mean, Ben Shapiro, I mean, of course, I disagree with Ben Shapiro on some issues, but I would, of course, not call him a fascist. He's not a fascist at all. You could perhaps call him a classical liberal, conservative, Republican, something like that, but a pseudo-fascist, I mean, that just so shows how childish and ridiculous this is getting.
Yes, but I think this is a very good example of exactly what's going on here, because to us who use this word in its traditional meaning, it seems just childish and stupid. But to someone who actually lives in this milieu of the very left, progressive, Antifa kind of milieu, to him it doesn't seem childish, because to him fascist means someone who is basically not progressive. And so therefore it fits. Everybody who opposes the social progress towards maximum individual freedom and self-expression is a fascist, and many other bad names. But what we see here happening is that, again, these two groups can almost no longer talk with each other, because they use the same word, but they mean something completely different with it. And I think one thing that is also very telling in this sense, and it's also a real big problem, that through this strategy that many people on the left are using, words kind of lose their meaning, and it's kind of like developing backwards and being less and less able to articulate yourself precisely. So, for example, racist used to be also a very specific term, meaning someone who has a bad view of someone else just because of his basically ethnic background. So his skin color or his hair color or just outwards expressions. And it's actually quite difficult to define the race, to really define this term. But a racist used to be someone who has a bad initial view of someone just because of that. But now, for example, some people would call you a racist if you oppose their affirmative action bills, which has nothing to do with the original term anymore. It's actually, to people on the conservative side, affirmative action is actually unjust, because you make certain laws for certain people and not the same laws for other people. And so they would say opposing affirmative action has to do with justice. But the other people say, no, you are just a racist. And so if you start using this term then basically for everybody who disagrees with you, then the term loses its meaning, and it loses its problematic meaning. And then at some point you get so far that people don't mind being called a racist anymore, because hell, 50% of the population are already racists. And so I don't really care if you call me a racist. Or the same happens, even more problematic, with the word rape. So rape used to be a horrible crime, but now, thanks to some leftist feminists, it means they use this word for so many things that it completely starts to lose its meaning. And this is actually a really big problem, because we need a word to describe the horrible crime of forcing yourself on a woman or on a man, just having sex with another person against their will. But if you use this word then for many things for which it was not intended, then it loses its meaning, and then you cannot express the really the precise meaning anymore, and so you become less able, yes, to articulate any thought in the end.
Right, exactly. And this trend toward meaninglessness, and also the trend toward ambiguity, it seems to be so destructive when it comes to rational dialogue and having a really productive conversation with people with whom you disagree. And I also heard this term, which sort of is fitting to this, the idea of weaponized ambiguity, which is basically that you can have ideas or statements or texts that are a bit ambiguous. It's not exactly clear what it means when it says something. And of course, this is something that certain ideological groups can exploit. And because it's ambiguous, an ambiguous statement in front of them, they can interpret it in the worst possible way to fit their own agenda. And that is very dangerous. I'm thinking of, say, hate speech laws. If you have hate speech laws that are promoted by the government, which says that hatred toward certain groups of sexual orientation, for instance, is illegal. Well, okay, what is hatred? What is meant by this? We know for a fact that the progressives would have a different understanding of hating people based on their sexual orientation than we would have, or some other group. So here we have an ambiguity, and it's very relevant who is interpreting this, and in what light, in light of what philosophical premises, or how will you understand certain things. So I think this idea of weaponized ambiguity is a very huge problem, very related to this that we were talking about. So yes, I think if you have people who are raised in a certain ideological environment where they hear these words such as love is love and people have the right to express themselves, and they don't really get a very good logical foundation for these meanings, they just are thrown out there, and they know that love is connected with something good. For instance, most people know that love is also connected to this idea of sacrificing yourself for someone else. For instance, if you have a parent who sacrifices his life to save his children, that's a very noble and beautiful act of love. So of course, love has a very good meaning, or connected to very good things. But if you have people who have this very good idea of love, and at the same time they have raised in this environment where they hear about love is love, that we need to promote love when it comes to the pride parades or transsexuals. Of course, if they have this very beautiful idea of love based on self-sacrifice in this place, and they hear love is love from the homosexual agenda or something like that, they might connect them and think, well, that sounds like homosexual activity or something is good because it has this connotation to the word love that they are using. So I think, yes, as we have been discussing, exploiting associations that words have is very dangerous, and also both in the sense of exploiting good words and bad words. And as we're speaking, if you have the word fascist, which is of course very connected to very bad things, and you exploit it to mean things that people who are simply not a progressive, like sort of Ben Shapiro is a pseudo-fascist. If you have never heard about Ben Shapiro at all, and the first thing you hear about him is some radical leftists calling him a pseudo-fascist, and you have no idea who Ben Shapiro is, perhaps you begin to think, oh, perhaps I shouldn't listen to him. Perhaps I should avoid him if it's really such a totalitarian guy. But of course, that's completely absurd. But because they never heard about Ben Shapiro, they might be completely deceived by these radical leftists and their exploitation of words. So yes, I think deception and weaponized ambiguity, to sum it up that way, is a huge problem.
Yes, I think you just mentioned a very important keyword, which is deception. And I think what's actually going on here is in almost always in some form or other a form of deception. So you are not openly stating your motives or your intent in as clear a language as you can, but instead you just kind of mix and muddle everything together and make a lot of smoke and a lot of fog. And so then you can't really be pinned down, and then you can always say, oh no, I'm just talking about love and justice. Do you have something against love and justice? Well, of course not. Okay, so then you can't really attack me. But what you're actually doing behind is something different. The aim that you're actually pursuing is something different. So it's a form of deception. And I think we have talked a lot now about the problematic side of this tactic or of this doing. And so my question is, do you see some kind of solution or some kind of way out of this problem? Or is it just going to get worse and worse until basically two groups of people don't understand each other anymore and stop talking to each other completely?
Yeah, well, I suppose I would say that what I have been thinking about as a sort of a solution is generally to emphasize when talking to other people the importance of using words with a meaningful sense and having a common and stable understanding of terms. And when you are in some rational dialogue or debate with someone, and that person uses terms and words that are exploited in his ideological fashion, it needs to be pointed out and one needs to be called out for doing so. And if one simply ignores that and comes up with his own statements and his own understanding of words and espouse that toward a person, your opponent in debate, then you can risk the problem of just talking past each other. So I think it's a good idea, I suppose, to make sure when you have a discussion with someone, especially if you have an audience listening in, that you have a different understanding of the concepts or words that we're talking about, and point that out explicitly whenever someone is calling that, and also just asking questions when people say, oh, I'm just in favor of love and justice. Well, what do you mean by love? What do you mean by justice? Can we please define these concepts or these words if we're going to talk about them? Now, I have the impression that some leftists would argue that, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what how we define words, because words are completely arbitrary. They are simply conventional. We can call words whatever you like because what's important are the concepts, not the words. Well, yes, true, words are referring to concepts, and it's really the concepts we're talking about. That's true. However, language is unavoidable. We have to have a certain understanding of words because words is the means by which we communicate concepts. So unless we have a clear and common understanding of specific words, then we are at loss. Then we can't use that as a means to communicate and debate each other. So yes, I think many of them miss the importance of language. And as we have been discussing in the beginning of this conversation, that language is about communicating truths and concepts and ideas. So we have to care about language, and we have to care about the precise and coherent usage of words as meaningful words. I think that's important. That's why definitions can't be avoided if there is a difference of understanding a word. So that's sort of the ideas that I have had in mind to try at least to solve this problem.
Yes, I like that a lot. I think that's a very good advice actually for all our listeners and for everybody who finds themselves frustrated by this kind of nebulous and exploitive meaning or abuse of words and with new meaning, to just basically ask, okay, what do you mean exactly by justice? Because when we can no longer take for granted that the two people talking together use the word in the same fashion, then you have to take a step back and maybe even a little bit annoyingly always ask, okay, what exactly do you mean by racist when you say Ben Shapiro is a racist? What exactly is a racist for you? And then And then I think this can help to bring again some clarity into this unclear environment, when you just basically stop using the very complicated words and use simpler words to describe the meaning that you're trying to convey. So for example, instead of just saying, I think this is unjust, you could say, I think this leads to a situation where some people might not get what they deserve from their past actions. And then you have just described basically in many words what you used to just call justice, but then it's more clear, and so it can be, it's more difficult to misunderstand it or misinterpret it. And as you said, ask to define the words in the conversation. I think that's, for philosophy, it's absolutely unavoidable to be on the same page. What is the definition?
Right, exactly. And yes, I think this is a general problem, both between the ideological left and the ideological right, but also other political or philosophical discussions. I remember when I was a libertarian, there was, of course, the debates and discussions about capitalism versus socialism. But of course, these two terms are somewhat ambiguous, and it's very difficult to have a very clear common definition of what these things are. And I remember, as a libertarian who supports capitalism, or an objectivist like Ayn Rand who supports capitalism, would define capitalism in a very, very precise term, making it a social system where individual rights are fully tolerated, and that you have a completely free market, no government handouts to any businesses whatsoever. That's at least the objectivist or libertarian definition of capitalism, just to take an example. But of course, many critics of capitalism would associate the system we have now with capitalism. I mean, okay, perhaps you can make an argument that we can call capitalism what we have today, but at least that has to be presented as an argument, and that has to be taken up as an issue when you're discussing with, say, libertarians or objectivists. So yes, capitalism and socialism are also two terms that are very important to define properly, because it's very easy to detect that people have different understandings and different applications of these two terms. So these economic systems are also good examples. And also, as we were talking about love, freedom, justice, rights, we also talked about abortion. There too, there are very problematic words. For instance, people who support abortion would say that women have a right to choose. Okay, but what do you mean by that? Right to choose what? What kind of right are we talking about? How do we, what's the foundation of rights? Are we talking about civil rights, moral rights? So that's very important to take into account. And yes, it's generally important, as you point out, to have definitions, because if you have definitions, then you have a very precise understanding of a term, and it's very easy to then, or of course there might be other problems, but it makes it easier to have a discussion with another person, because then you can at least refer to the same concept by referring to the same word. Because again, words are the means by which we communicate to another person verbally, and that's simply unavoidable. So yes, definitions are very important. So that is certainly something that needs to be emphasized more, and it's also something that I myself have thought a little bit about when I have certain discussions or debates with people. Care about definitions and be very specific when you define things. Another example is when we discussed conspiracy theorists. I remember or at least I tried to define conspiracy or conspiracy theory in the beginning. And I think that's very important too, because the word conspiracy theorist is also thrown out there and abused. So yes, I think that's a general principle everyone needs to take into account. Define terms, especially terms that have very huge importance in debates and discourses.
Yes, I think that's also a good take-home message for me myself. I want to again place more emphasis on defining terms whenever I start to talk with someone about some philosophical topic, because I also remember I had a conversation some days ago where we talked for quite a long while and it was getting frustrating, and in the end I just found out that this person uses a word in a way that I would absolutely not use it. And so if we could have just cleared this in the beginning, then we could have just saved a lot of aggravation and back and forth and all that. So yes, I think I will really take this as a lesson for myself. I don't know if I think that's actually probably good enough. For example, if I just think about some interview between Jordan Peterson and some very baiting TV host, and then they always ask questions like, so are you against women's rights? Or so you are not in favor of liberty or of individual freedom or something like that? And then you should always just ask back, what do you mean by liberty? Or what do you mean by women's rights? Do you mean, for example, whatever the right to find a job without asking your husband? Well, then of course I am in favor. But do you mean something very weird that I just can't now imagine an example? Then you can unmask this loaded question. And maybe again, it's also good to make it a habit that if you say something, then not just make the statement, but always insert your definition of how you use the word. So for example, I don't think this is just because I think this and that, or because some people might not get the reward for some work that they did. And then you not only say that you think it's unjust, but you also say what you mean by unjust. And that should help to clear up a lot of things.
Right, yes. I was also just reminded on a conversation yesterday, so it was very recent, where there was a person who stated that she believed morality was subjective. And of course, people who disagree with her criticized that notion and argue that, well, do you really mean that something can be morally good in one society and morally bad in another society? And show that that's just not true, that doesn't make any sense. But when she responded, she was rather talking about morality being dependent upon a specific situation. And then there was a confusion. But then finally, it got discovered that she didn't really mean that morality was subjective. She meant that morality was situational, that what is moral or immoral depends on a specific situation or specific circumstances. That's not quite the same thing as saying morality is subjective. Because to say morality is subjective, that means that the truth of moral ideas are based upon what you think. But that's not the same as saying situations, that morality is dependent upon situations. So that's just an example from yesterday, I remember, where the term subjective, situational, very, very important to distinguish these two. That's very important. And because elsewhere you don't get anywhere, because you just get the misunderstanding, confusion, and of course these things, confusion, misunderstanding, that is happening so often in discourse and debates. I think that's perhaps one of the main reasons why so many discussions are not getting anywhere and are not productive, because they don't understand what each other are saying. And that also is related to another problem, that people in debates or discussions are not really willing to listen to what the other person is saying, but only willing to come up with his own arguments or phrases. And when the other person is speaking, you're just waiting for him to finish so that you can say your part, regardless of what the other person is saying. And perhaps I have to confess that I think I've done the same sometimes myself. So this is perhaps a general bias that all of us have. But at least we should be aware of it, that when you have someone talking to you from a different angle, try as best as we can to understand what he's saying and ask for clarification. And I mean, one of the persons who really cared a lot about that was Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher. He was really concerned about definitions and asking questions to make the person more and more clear about what he believes, and trying to clear out what his philosophy really was on this specific issue. So perhaps we could use him as a role model, and of course he's considered to be one of the greatest philosophers or persons to discuss philosophy with. So yes, that's also something to think about, I suppose.
Yes, I really like that. I really like that, because I was just before thinking, isn't this a very old problem? So this is exactly what the sophists used to do, to muddle the meaning of language and just make a big mess, so that in the end they could then use emotional tricks to make you believe their argument, but they didn't actually have a good argument. They just made a big confusion and then pulled the right strings at the right time. And so I think that the one thing that we have found now is to ask for clarifications or for definitions. The other thing that I also really liked about what you just said is to really listen to the other person. Because if you really try to understand what the other person is trying to say, and not just waiting so that you can make your point, then I think also this will inevitably lead to asking questions about the important words until you have disentangled the whole entangled web or of unfamiliar usage of different words. Because when you really try to understand what someone is trying to say, and they say something which doesn't make any sense to you, then you will say, wait, I didn't quite understand it. So why exactly is this unjust? Or why exactly is this social justice? And then you will in the end arrive, aha, so you mean social justice is just equality of outcome, basically, for you. Is that right? And then you have solved the puzzle in some sense, or then you understand what they mean by what they say.
Right, exactly. And by doing this, you also appear as someone who wants to explore the opponent's view. And that itself might be seen as a virtue when discussing with other persons. And also we have been talking about rules of conduct and good principles when it comes to discussing with other persons. That was a topic for a conversation we had one time. And I think this principle is also relevant to that if you ask for clarification, try to come to a common agreement about the definition, that makes you also seem as exploring other person's view and open-minded and stuff like that. So I think that's very good and contributive to a productive dialogue. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And it's also certainly something that should be emphasized in education. It seems that many children are brought up in schools where definitions and clarifications in dialogue is not really emphasized. And that seems to be a problem, I would say, and also combined with the problem that the language itself in several places are to some extent being a little bit degenerated. It's getting worse. It seems that there are so many words that were used back in the day that people simply don't use anymore. People try to dumb down the language, and we have all this very digitalized meme words and phrases. For instance, the different words people use on 4chan. That's not very highly sophisticated language, people can say, but it's a very dumbed down way of communicating with each other. And that's also problematic, because then you have a lot of people, the new generation of people, who lack knowledge of many good words that language had back in the day. And that might create problems when you try to espouse and explain your own view, that you don't find the right words to describe yourself properly. So I think that's a problem, that people and their understanding of language is to some extent, and with some people, degenerating. And that seems to be a problem on the internet, like I mentioned, 4chan and similar channels. And it's something that that education doesn't address good enough, I suppose. That's also two considerations I would want to make there.
Yes. Yes, I think though that the important words will come back. It's like you once said very nicely that when you try to get rid of the natural order, then it just comes back in a distorted way. And so I think the good words or the important words will also come back, maybe in a good way or maybe in a distorted way. But if there is a concept that is important for your thinking, then there will be some phrase to describe it, because it can't be otherwise, because it's an important concept. And so I guess this problem might only be mostly a temporary problem, and then at some point there will come either a new way or some way to express this concept, because it is important for thinking.
Right, that's a good point that you made there, because we can't really escape our nature, and it is within our human nature to have language and to use words to describe concepts. And if we lose a specific word for a concept, then people will have to invent a new one. And of course, some people would perhaps point out that we are importing words from other languages. That's a phenomenon here in Norway and probably in many other countries as well, that we are using more and more English words. And of course, you might have arguments that that's a bad thing because you want to preserve the traditional Norwegian. But at least the English words can be used to describe and clarify certain things. And I know myself, for myself, that I have sometimes been trying to describe or explain something, and I cannot find a Norwegian word for that. So I'm actually just using the English word because that's what's come to mind. And that's a phenomenon that I think are happening to many people. And yes, of course, language is unavoidable, and finding words to describe something, that's something that we have to do to be able to communicate things to each other. So yes, that's a good point. And yes, I think we made very many good points in this conversation, generally speaking. So I suppose if this is sort of a place to sum up what we've been talking about, I would sort of say that we have said that language is about communicating information or knowledge by means of words combined in sentences, combined in larger texts. If you want to have you can have it written or you can have it spoken. You can say words or write it down on a paper and make others read. And of course, language might be different from country to country, society to society, in what kind of words they use, what kind of sentences and phrases they use, but the language is always referring to objective reality, and that's unavoidable. And if you deny it, that's self-defeating, because you're always using language to refer to objective ideas and things. And we see that meaning is very important. Language must have a meaning, it must have a precise content, and it's a very huge problem that the progressive left today is abusing words and terms so that you just make the rational dialogue and debate very problematic. You make it frustrating and it doesn't go anywhere. And you can have ambiguity of statements that can be weaponized and abused, and in worst case you can make the state do bad things, for instance with the hate speech laws, by defining hate speech to be whatever disagrees with your progressive agenda. So a very important precision in what kind of words you use, definitions, clarifications, very important. That has to be emphasized in society, in education, and that's something that we all need to take into account when we discuss with other people. So that's sort of how I would summarize the important points that we have made today.
Yes, I think that's a very good summary, and I would just add one thing, which is that you should really strive in a dialogue to understand what the other person is trying to say. And I think if you have this as your goal, then the dialogue will actually become fruitful in sooner or later. But if you just have as a goal to make some cheap points, by making the other person look stupid, for example, then it will not work out well. And so if you really try to understand what the other person is saying, then you will automatically keep asking for clarifications or for definitions until you have reached again a common ground where you use the language in the same manner, and so you understand what the other person is saying. And so I think it's always the same things that we rediscover, but I think this is really what we should take to heart when we really have a conversation with anyone. So I think that's what I would add to this summary.
Yes, I agree. And we can point out that discourse is a two-way street. It's something that is common to both participants, and therefore clarification, exploring the other person's opinion, it seems to be very important, or at least very beneficial. So yes, I think that's a good place to stop the conversation. I don't know if we have anything more to add to that, unless you want to discuss something further, but I think we have made very good points which people really need to take into account when discussing and debating.
Yes, no, I agree, absolutely. And I would just thank you very much for coming on my channel and having this conversation with me. And I hope it was of interest to the audience. It was certainly of interest to me. And then I would wish you and the audience a nice Friday evening and a good weekend.
Thank you for having me on, and I wish you too a good Friday and a good weekend, as well as the audience.
Okay, so see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.